Christian doctrine did not and could not have created science.
You're making
And
enough.
believing in God does not have anything to do with whether we can know things.
What up, everybody? My name is Angelos, and this is The Right Story. I do videos about science and faith and apologetics and culture and theology and a lot more. But today, I just wanted to do a short video responding to Aron in a dialogue I did with him about a year ago. I did respond to him in this dialogue. We talked about science and faith, but I thought, hey, why not use this as a teaching opportunity to help you guys understand that Christianity had a decisive role in giving the world modern science. Now, I'd be happy to debate Aron again if there's a moderator, but unfortunately that dialogue we did was a little bit out of hand, and I just basically stopped engaging near the end. However, if Aron or any other atheist wants to tango with me in terms of debates, I'd love to do that if there was a moderator. So basically, the relationship between science and faith is one where modern science, as we know it, came about through the presuppositions that God gave to us in the Bible. And when you think about that, it's a little bit like offering your child a hammer for his tool set and whatever, if he wants to play with it or whatever he wants to do. And then your child takes that hammer and runs over and smashes a picture of you on the wall. That's basically what atheists are trying to do with science and Christianity. So let's look at some of the claims that Aron made, because some of those claims were actually patently false, and it's not too hard to show why.
Christian doctrine actually stands against science. And it doesn't matter if you want to start with the Ionian Greeks, like 6 centuries BCE, or if you start with the Enlightenment with people who were admittedly in Christian-dominated countries, and most of them were Christian to some degree. The science was only permitted because the church was beginning to loosen its grip of complete control over mind and thought.
When do you think modern science, began? Maybe you could just tell me your thoughts on how that took place.
Well, maybe I just did. I
Or
just did.
do you
I,
believe?
I,
Can I ask what your thoughts on the scientific revolution are then? What are your thoughts? What spurred on the scientific
I told
revolution?
you can go back to the Ionian Greeks, who were atheists around 600 BCE, and you can also go to the Enlightenment, and you can see the development in the history of science of people who lived in predominantly Christian countries, some of whom were even theologians. But in every case, these people had to challenge their own belief systems to make any discoveries at all. Very often, the church would suppress or repress or oppress anything that seemed damaging to doctrine. But fortunately, during the time of Catholic reign, where there weren't Catholicism didn't allow people to read the Bible the way that the Protestant the Protestant years did. So we didn't have quite the same conflict that
Hmm.
you did during Catholic reign. But there were some scientists whose discoveries were squelched, who were inhibited by their religious belief system, or that their faith was. I'm trying to think of the specific names, because each of the scientists that people often name, you'll say, well, this guy was a creationist. Yeah. And he's contradicting creation. Or he wasn't a creationist, he was a Christian, but he's contradicting creation in his studies. And there was just a time when the church wasn't being quite so oppressive in its control of mind
Hmm.
and thought, and would allow people to publish certain things until it became too damaging.
Hmm. Well, I'll just kind of state. You talked about the Ionian Greeks. Do you think they were atheists?
Well, by virtue of the fact that they say they don't believe in any gods, that would make them atheists, yes. But they're typically portrayed as questioning the existence of of gods, the gods, and
Hmm.
establishing that things were not based on mysteries.
Well, Aron subscribes to what's called the conflict narrative. When people think about science and faith, the popular conception that people have in mainstream society is that science is somehow at war with God, and that religion is opposed to facts and it's superstitious, whereas science is cold hard data. And so the conflict narrative really has its roots into revisionist historians that came about in the 19th century, guys like John Draper and Andrew Dixon White. These guys literally just made up some stories, especially the one about not Galileo, Christopher Columbus, and how the church was admonishing him not to travel the globe because if he did so, he'd fall off the end of the earth, and other such stories. They're just pure fabrication. And today, nobody really takes that narrative seriously unless you're an atheist on YouTube who doesn't do a lot of research. I love Aron, but unfortunately, there's not a lot of depth to a lot of the content that he's sharing with people today. So Aron believes wholeheartedly in this conflict narrative that science is somehow at war with religion, and he basically builds his ministry or his YouTube profile on this idea. So according to this conflict narrative, science, as we know it, began with the ancient Greeks who were atheists, and that's what he says. People talk about guys like Thales and Anaximander, Anaxagoras, Heraclitus, Xenophanes, and these are typically called the Ionians or the pre-Socratics. Thales, who's usually talked about as like the first of the Ionians who really started to bring about science, he actually sacrificed an ox to the gods when he discovered his famous geometry theorem. He's quoted as saying, all things are full of gods. Anaximander believed in something called the Apiron, that there's this divine force behind the universe. All of them believed in some kind of divine causative principle. He called it the Logos, the Nous, the Apiron, the one God. So virtually all the pre-Socratics were not atheists. None of them were really in the strict sense. The closest that we get to any kind of atheism in that time period is from people like Democritus and Leucippus. And they didn't even really believe in atheism either. There's no like explicit mention of atheism back in the day. They just said that if the gods were real, perhaps they were disinterested in our affairs, and we should not really care about the gods either because they're probably so removed from our world that they're essentially meaningless to us. But remember, Aron initially said that all these guys were atheists, and that's where science began. That is patently false.
In order for Christianity, in order for Christian doctrine to have established science, one, in my field of having studied this exact topic for as long as I have, I'm wondering why nobody's ever been able to justify such a wild claim as that. Just up to now, it's just been never the case.
When you're making a point or when you're arguing for a certain proposition, you do have to quote experts in the field, people like you said, who've been peer reviewed and who have the respect of the academic community. So that's kind of what I was hoping to do. Was I'm making a point or a proposition here that science was essentially founded on the Christian doctrine of creation. So I was going to
Right, but we don't have any citation from doctrine. There's no part of doctrine that
I'm
supports
getting
that.
to that, right?
There's no history that supports that. We
So
know that the actual history contradicts that. So that part's done.
Aron then goes on to tell us that this doctrine, this idea that science was created essentially by the presuppositions of Christianity, is he said he's never heard of that. Nobody's ever said anything like that, and that's just, he's just flabbergasted by the idea that science could have somehow been influenced by Christianity. So for a list of modern scholars, we could go into this, but here's some guys that really do have discussed this in academic literature and talked about how the doctrine of creation really did provide the impetus needed for modern science to begin. People like David Lindbergh, Peter Harrison, Thomas Merton, Pierre Duhem, Peter Hodgson, Stanley Jackie, Christopher Kaiser, Lauren Isley, M.B. Foster, Owen Gingrich, Ian Barber, Eugene Claren, and more. Because people asked the X factor question, what gave rise to modern science, especially during the scientific revolution? What was it that changed and allowed people to just explode with all this innovation and scientific breakthroughs? And when people have asked this question, it's also called the Needham question or other things, because even a guy from Oxford named Joseph Needham was preoccupied with the Chinese, and he's like, how come the Chinese never really invented science even though they had all the material necessities for this? Other people have asked the question about the ancient Babylonians, because all these ancient cultures did have a lot of the things needed for modern science to begin. And people have created a list of, X, Y, and Z. You need sort of a level of prosperity. You need a culture that will allow this, and sorts of things. And they said, but still, all these ancient cultures never really replicated what happened during the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe. So people said, what was up with that? How did modern science actually begin? And when they started looking into it, they found that there was really a change in culture, a change in thinking, and that came about through theology. So prior to this time, believe it or not, the world was actually based, a lot of the academic world, the scientific world was based on Greek philosophy. So even though these dudes were living in a Christian world, they essentially were operating out of a Greek pagan philosophy framework. And what that did was that it inhibited their ideas about the natural world. The Greeks reasoned, they used deductive reasoning. They believed, they had a lot of confidence in their own ideas about the world, when really those ideas were based more on their own presuppositions than they were about the natural world itself. Christians, obviously, they kind of they stripped the idea of polytheism and animism from their beliefs, but they were still operating out of this mental framework. In the 12th and 13th centuries, people started to divorce themselves from Aristotle and Greek thinking, and a change came through people like John Duns Scotus, William of Ockham. They were called the nominalists, and these guys really just said, look, God is the creator of the whole universe. We got to move away from these Aristotelian ideas that says God can't do certain things, or the world has to be a certain way. They said God is free to create the world any such way he wants. And after the Protestant Reformation, things really started to kind of pick up from there. People started to focus on the doctrine of original sin. They said, we can't really trust our reason as much as the Greeks did. We really got to use empiricism. We got to go test the natural world. We got to go do experiments and see what the natural world is for ourselves, because we can't really trust just the ideas that are floating around in our mind. We need to trust what revelation tells us about the natural world, i.e., that it's created, and we need to trust that we need to go and explore and see how God created the world. And the other part of the doctrine of creation that falls into this is that they believed that the world was rational and orderly. Remember, according to a Greek worldview, they believed that the world was a little bit chaotic. There might be some divine forces or a divine force behind the world, but essentially they didn't know who this divine force was. They didn't know that it was dependable or trustworthy. They just thought it was there. Kind of like the Hindu idea of karma. In a sense, Hindus really don't really trust uh, their karma. They don't really trust. They don't really know if that idea of the divine force is reliable. They tend to think that if somebody's homeless on the streets, that's their karma. There's no real rational basis for how the divine entity might act. Really, they could act on the whims, kind of like Greek gods. But when the reformers and a lot of the even Catholics at that time started to push away from Greek philosophy, they said, hey, we got to focus on the doctrine of creation. God created the world, so the world must reflect his rational nature in every way. People like Descartes started to come up with the idea of natural laws, that the world operated according to laws that were unchanging. Now, what's ironic is that people talk about natural laws today as sort of tools to weaponize against God, but the concept itself is a Christian concept. And that's because people said, look, if God created the world, he must have instantiated his rationality into the world. So, all that to say, during the 16th and 17th centuries, really there was this paradigm shift that came about, and the doctrine of creation was front and center within this paradigm shift. That's why John Hedley Brooke, one of the former chairs of the Department of Science and Religion at Oxford, and one of the best historians of science that we talk about in this regard, says the following: natural philosophers of the 17th century would present their work as a search for order in a universe regulated by an intelligent creator. A created universe, unlike one that had always existed, was one in which the creator had been free to exercise his will in devising the laws that nature should obey. A doctrine of creation could give coherence to the scientific endeavor insofar as it implied a dependable order behind the flux of nature. Now, that was a lot of fancy and technical words there, but essentially what he's saying is that the doctrine of creation provided the mental framework that these early scientific revolutionaries were using. Another scholar named Rodney Stark, who's a well-respected sociologist, says this as well. It thus could be said that the proposition that the universe had an intelligent designer is the most fundamental of all scientific theories. Okay, so
Because the conversation that I've had many times is people will say that, hey, did you know that Sir Isaac Newton was a creationist? Yeah, he's one of those few pre-Darwinian scientists who would actually qualify as a creationist. However, Christianity, his creationism, contributed nothing to anything he ever discovered or postulated that he's being remembered for now. Nothing, not a thing.
now, here's another patently false claim from Aron regarding Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton was essentially the poster boy for the scientific revolution. And during the Enlightenment, all these skeptics and atheists who were attacking the church were basically Newton fanboys. They loved Newton. They were trying to base their philosophy off of Newton, except Newton himself based his philosophy on the doctrine of creation. So Aron says that Newton's creationism had nothing to do with the science. It really was something he had to push aside. And if you just do a little bit of research, nothing could be further from the truth. So Newton was actually one of the most theologically minded scientific pioneers of the time. His work was grounded in the doctrine of creation. Not only that, but in another few doctrines, the doctrine of God's omnipresence and God's immutability. So when Newton was coming up with his inverse square law, he actually paraphrased from Acts 17:28 in his work De Gravitationis. And he talks about how if God is omnipresent, then gravity should be applicable to everywhere in the universe, because if it reflected his rational order, then there's no reason for us to think that gravity does not apply to things in outer space. Furthermore, in his Principia, Newton goes on to say that he basically bases his whole framework off of the idea that God is rational, that he created the universe, and that it's our job to sort of go and look for the ways that God had created the universe. He says the following: this most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. So far from being an aside to his scientific work, Newton's creationism was actually front and center. It was the foundation mentally, it was the presupposition that he was using to build his ideas about the world. And that's what the Bible does. It gives us the right ideas to make sense of the world. And if you have any questions about why the world is, going to hell, metaphorically and literally in a sense, in a handbasket, you need to look at why that is and how we've lost the presuppositions that have guided Western society. Not saying that Western society is perfect by any means, but there are certain protective coverings that Christianity gave our minds, and it grounded us in reality. When we lose those things, we fall back into utter chaos and meaninglessness. That's why there's something called a crisis of legitimacy now, because we understand that humans are worth value. We understand that human rights are a thing. We understand that love is real, truth is good, and beauty is real, but we have no way to justify any of these things from a naturalistic or atheistic point of view. And our culture, again, is largely built on materialism now. It's largely built on the idea where we're a secular society and God is sort of a private truth. But that's why we're seeing so much chaos and so much hurt and pain in people's lives, is because we've rebelled against the idea that God created the world, and we've rejected the idea that God gave us souls. And that's why we have intrinsic worth, is because we're made in his image and we have an eternal sense of dignity. You lose those things, you lose the plot essentially, and you've got nothing to base any ideas that are very important, foundational to you on. I just want to say, if you like this video and maybe support me and help me to get better equipment to move forward and to have more time to produce these kinds of content, I'd love to keep doing this. So please do me a favor, like and subscribe and share with your friends. You can go to my website, www.therightstory.org, and you can help support me there. But please give me some feedback, tell me your thoughts, and if you have any questions, put them in the comments. I'd love to get in touch with you. So God bless you, and yeah, feel free to shout out any comments you may have.